Oh, good.
Interesting. Okay, welcome. This is our adult forum here at the Parish of the Good Shepherd. This is week 3 of 4 on Celtic Christianity. And as I said, I'm going to start. We had some noise over here briefly, so my apologies if we have some more noise in the room. It is just me in the Loring room today, so you have my full attention, everyone online. Where we are, not anymore. Christina's come in. No, that's fine. Oh, and we have someone else coming in too. Looks like Ernie. I don't know which Ernie that is, but hello, Ernie. Anyone know who Ernie would be?
I know only Ernie Janili.
Oh, Ernie. Yes, thank you. Hopefully this is Ernie Janili. Good afternoon, Ernie. Hello. Good seeing you. As I was saying, we are on week 3 of 4 for Celtic Christianity. I will ask everyone to mute themselves if you haven't already muted yourself. And we're going to get right into this. So where are we? Oh, here comes Mary Ellen. Where are we in our series? Well, I started out 2 weeks ago on the origins of Celtic Christianity, so sort of the transition from the Roman Empire to the fall of Rome and this abandonment of the Britons and who are Christian, the movement of the Angles and the Saxons into Eastern England, and the sort of movement of the Britons westward into Wales, and then also into Brittany and into the Iberian Peninsula. And then eventually how the Britons decided not to evangelize to the Angles and the Saxons, but instead to continue to go westward to evangelize to the Celts, to the Irish people, and to the Picts and the Scots in the north, and how there was establishment of Iona as a monastic center to Christianity in the Western British Isles. And then the re-Romanization of Christianity in the British Isles. We had Augustine of Canterbury come in and try to sort of reestablish ties to Rome. And he evangelized to the Saxons and converted the Saxons, and the Saxons were already partially converted. And for a while, we had sort of 2 systems of Christianity in the British Isles. We had the Roman Christianity centered in Canterbury, and then we had Celtic Christianity really centered in Iona, which was off the western coast of Scotland. And this was fine and peachy for a while, but as is always the case, the tensions arose, and especially in the Kingdom of Northumbria, in the northern part of England, we had a monarch who was raised as a Celtic Christian, but who was now King of Northumbria and was sort of in contact with the other Saxon kingdoms to the south, who were Roman Christian. And the question became, how are we going to reconcile this? Well, he had the Synod of Whitby, and at the Synod of Whitby, the Roman tradition won out, which means that all of the monks in the British Isles had to cut their hair a certain way, the Roman way, and we were going to calculate the date of Easter in the Roman way. And really, those were the 2 big changes that happened. So now what's happened after that? That's where we are this week. Well, the rediscovery of Celtic Christianity. For a while after that, it seems as if Christianity in the British Isles was following along, as was Christianity in most of the Western world, sort of in the Roman tradition. There was a sense, though, that Celtic Christianity was gone but not forgotten. People remembered the stories of Celtic Christians, especially the Celtic Christian saints. And in the 8th and 9th centuries, there were a lot of hagiographies, stories of the saints, of these early 4th, 5th, and 6th century Celtic saints. And you remember Father Jay last week mentioned the Venerable Bede, who was writing, I believe, in 7th century, 7th, 8th century. But there were many great hagiographies of these early Celtic Christians. And, as is often the case, human beings tend to be antiquarians, in that we look to the past and we always see a golden age, an age that was better than life today. And of course, the Christians in the 8th and 9th centuries felt like the world was besought with corruption and the church was not going well. And they could look back to these perfect paragons of saintly piety back in the 4th and the 5th century. And they were like, well, if only we could get back to that, right? So the Celtic Christians were sort of upheld as saintly in a way that the church in the 8th and 9th century wasn't, right? And if you go further along into the Middle Ages, in the 12th and 13th century, there was a sort of a little mini medieval Renaissance, the High Renaissance. And within that, there was a flourishing of lyricism, of literary works, of fiction, of not only biographies and nonfiction, but of fiction tales and legends. And this is where we get the legends of King Arthur, right? The Arthurian legends. King Arthur was king of the Britons, right? The Britons were Celts. And so this is the story of most certainly a mythic king, but a king that existed in that 4th and 5th century, sort of before Patrick came on the scene, but after the Saxons had arrived and pushed the Britons out. And so you have this Welsh British monarch who's preserving Christianity, right? When all around him is paganism. And so there was a strong Christianizing element to this literary tradition in the 12th and 13th century. And then, of course, we move into the 16th century to the Reformation, right? The Protestant Reformation, and also the Roman Catholic Counter-Reformation. I'm going to speak a little bit more to this, but these people latched on to Celtic Christianity, not just in a romantic way, but in a political way. There was a sort of a propaganda aspect to this sort of appreciation of Celtic Christianity. So what was happening? What was happening? I'm actually going to move this because I think this is blocking people's sight lines. There we go. Come over here. So let's take a few steps back from the Reformation. Before the Protestant Reformation, what did the church look like in the West? What did the church look like? Well, contrary to what you might think, it was actually incredibly, incredibly diverse. There were all different flavors of Christianity in the West. And people didn't think of themselves as Roman Catholic. They just thought of themselves as Christian, or sort of Western Christians. They belonged to the church in the West because, of course, there was the distinction between the Western Church and the Eastern Church. They were not Eastern Orthodox, they were Western, but they would have called themselves just Christians or Western Christians. Everyone was allied with Rome. Everyone respected the Pope and saw his authority. But the way that the church sort of evolved and developed had all of these regional differences. So the church in France looked very different from the church in England, and different from the church in, say, Milan, which looked very different from the church in Rome. Even though Milan and Rome are both on the Italian peninsula, the church looked different. The order of the Mass was different. The prayers used were different. The canon, the Eucharistic prayer was different. The holidays that were celebrated were different. There were all these sort of regional flavors to the church. And that was perfectly fine and natural. No one thought that, well, we're not unified with Rome, right? This is just the way that the church is. Well, what this means is that when the Protestant Reformation happened, now in the West, there's a big distinction. Are you with Rome or not? And for those Protestants who decided not to be with Rome, all of a sudden for Rome, it became very important for themselves, for people allied with the Roman Church, to look all unified and conform to each other. And so there was a counter-reformation in the Roman Church. And this is where, again, now we have sort of this Roman Catholic identity. If you were Roman Catholic, you now started thinking of yourselves as Roman Catholic, not just as a Western Christian, but Roman Catholic. I'm allied with the Pope. And one of the consequences of the Counter-Reformation, which really happened around the Council of Trent, this is 1545 to 1563, was the establishment of uniformity and conformity across the entire Western Roman Catholic Church. So all of a sudden, all of these regional flavors were squashed out. So the Roman Mass is the one that became authoritative for all Christians in the Western world who wanted to be allied with Rome. So the church in Milan had to sort of throw out the Ambrosian rite. If you were in the United Kingdom, the Sarum rite sort of went into the dustbin, right? Everything that you now worship, the prayers that you say in the service, the look of the service, the way the calendar is structured, which saint days happen when, all of it now becomes universal. Wherever you go in the Catholic Church in the West, in Europe, it's going to look the same. And so in reaction to that, in England, we have the Protestant, the English Reformation. And one of the things that they want to do is now differentiate themselves from the Roman Catholic Church, which now looks very monolithic. It looks like it's universal, it's huge, and it's the same everywhere. And the English reformers say, well, you know, it wasn't too long ago that the church wasn't the same everywhere. And we remember that there was a type of Christianity here in the British Isles that actually was in conflict for a little bit with the Christianity that came out of Rome, thinking back all the way to Augustine of Canterbury, right? That there was a Christianity in the British Isles that stood in opposition to Rome. And therefore, there is a Christianity in the British Isles that is more authentic, older than Roman Christianity. And therefore, our heritage as English Christians should go all the way back to that. Should go all the way back to Celtic Christianity, not to Roman Christianity. Roman Christianity is an alien Christianity that invaded our shores. And even now, as we're trying to break free as reformers, is trying to put their tentacles into the British Isles. And Rome should not be in Britain at all. And so this is a very politicized statement, right? But it is this idea that the Roman Church is foreign. Now, we just take a step back and think about that, we'll realize how ridiculous that statement is. Christianity came into the British Isles at the very, very beginning through the Roman Empire, right? So, you know, that's sort of false to say that Rome was always alien. And it's also the case that Celtic Christianity really was not in opposition to Roman Christianity. The English reformers in the 16th century really sort of frothed up this conflict. If you remember the Synod of Chester, where the Archbishop of Canterbury, Augustine, sort of came and met with the Celtic bishops, and Augustine was very rude. He declined to stand and greet his fellow bishops as colleagues and as brothers, and remained seated like a king. And the Celtic bishops said, "Aha! This is proof that he does not come in fellowship or in love. He does not come in the name of Christ, and therefore we reject him." Well, this came out of the Venerable Bede. It's one of the stories that he wrote down. Whether it happened or not, we don't really know. But that conflict was sort of amped up in the 16th century. And it really became told again and again and again, hey, there was this instance where the Roman Church and the Celtic Church were really in opposition. Now, if we could go all the way back to the 4th century and see the Synod of Chester, we'd probably realize that, you know, there may have been some hurt feelings, but all of these people actually viewed themselves as in communion with each other. Celtic Christians did not feel like they were in opposition to Roman Christians back in the 4th century. They would have all viewed themselves as being loyal to the Pope. And if you remember, the big differences between Celtic Christianity and Roman Christianity was tonsure, how the monks cut their hair, and the calculation of the date of Easter. There were most certainly differences in the Mass, in which prayers were used, even in the calendar of the saints, right? But that was not so important as to become a stumbling block for most of the history in the West until the 16th century. Diversity in worship was the norm. And yet all of these people in the West still viewed themselves as in communion with each other. It's only because of the Protestant Reformation that people decided we've got to make a conflict in the past where in actuality none existed. And so It's in the 16th century, really, in the English Reformation, where people start saying, aha, Celtic Christianity was the more authentic form of Christianity in the British Isles. And it has always been opposed to Rome. And Rome was an alien influence and crushed us way back in the day. Well, now it's our turn to crush Rome and throw off the shackles of Rome. This is all it's hyperbolic, but it's also it's a polemic. It is a political statement, and it has influenced our interpretation of Celtic Christianity ever since. So, we get to what's happening after the English Reformation. Now there is a Church of England. Church of England is now independent from Rome. And there is an increased interest in our roots, in our Celtic roots. And the Stowe Missal was an ordinal, sort of a mass book for the priests. It was written in Latin sometime in the very late 8th century, possibly the early 9th century. And it was written in Ireland in sort of one of these areas that persisted in Celtic tradition. So remember, even after the Synod of Whitby, when everyone adopted the Roman calendar for calculating the date of Easter and the Roman haircuts for the monks, you still had diversity of worship. You still had different mass books, different Eucharistic prayers, different calendars for the saints. So all of these aspects were still very diverse. And what was happening down in Canterbury would still be very different from what was happening up in Iona. Iona did not disappear. It was not obliterated from the map. It still persisted. And throughout the British Isles, you had different rites, different liturgical practices springing up and growing and evolving. And in Ireland, someone kept with the Celtic tradition of worship and had their little mass book. It was annotated a little bit later in the mid-11th century, and it was placed in a silver box called a cumdach. And if you come to church at Good Shepherd, you'll see our gospel book is sort of encased in a golden cover, a metal cover. That's kind of like a modern day cumdach. The cumdach would encase this book on all sides. It would clasp up, right? And it treated the book almost as if it were a relic. Cumdaches are sort of a class of reliquaries because by the time of the mid-11th century, people realized this thing is really old. It's a couple hundred years old, and it's maintaining a tradition that may have been evolving and changing and sort of disappearing, even in the Irish Isles and in the Scottish Isles. And it was eventually hidden away in an Irish castle in a wall, and it was rediscovered in the 18th century. And then it was bought by the first Marquis of Buckingham in Buckinghamshire, which is just right outside of London, who was the owner of a big palatial country house called Stowe House. And so this is why it is called the Stowe Missal. And in 1819, the Marquis of Buckingham revealed it to the world, right? And sort of published it and presented it. And everyone was really interested in this Stowe Missal because, again, it speaks to the quote unquote origins of the English church. The origins of the English church are Celtic in nature. They're not Roman. Roman is the alien influence, right? So people are very interested in this Stowe Missal. It speaks to Celtic Christianity, which by now had completely disappeared in sort of the British Isles, for the most part. Of course, the Marquis was very wealthy and his heir was very wealthy. And then the heir to the heir went bankrupt, as is often the case. And so he had to sell his wonderful library to the state, and the United Kingdom was very happy to purchase it. And at that time, they decided all of these wonderful books that the former Marquis of Buckinghamshire, Buckingham had, all the English ones would go to the libraries in England, and anything that had to pertain to Ireland would go to the Royal Irish Academy over in Dublin, which is what happened in 1883. And that's where it resided. Now, this missal sort of has 6 parts to it. If you open it up, remember, it's in a cumdach, so it's in a little metal box. The first part of it is all written in Latin, in sort of ecclesial church Latin. And the first part has extracts from the Gospel of John. And then there is the ordinary, the canon of the Mass. The canon is what we would call the Eucharistic prayer, right? And then after that are sort of special Masses for specific occasions. And then there's an order of baptism and communion for the newly baptized. And then, just like our Book of Common Prayer, right? These are the pastoral offices, the visitation of the sick, administration of extreme unction. That's what back in the day people used to call anointing of the sick, extreme unction and communion for someone who was probably at the end of their life. And then in Old Irish, so remember this, the Stone Missal was annotated in the 11th century. In Old Irish, this is where those annotations come in. There's a short treatise, on the Mass, sort of explaining the importance of the Mass. And then 3 short spells, which you might find surprising, but actually in the Middle Ages, there was a lot of superstition. This was actually one of the reasons why the Protestant reformers were really fed up with the Roman Church, because the Roman Church permitted and almost encouraged a lot of this superstitious behavior that they found had no bearing to the Bible, had really no place in being a disciple of Christ. It was holdovers from sort of pagan traditions. And here we have in the Stone Missal 3 spells. So people loved the Stone Missal because it spoke to an aspect of the British Christian tradition that was no longer extant. It did not exist. It was not in practice in the Church of England. And it was part of a big movement in the 18th and now 19th centuries. So if you remember what's happening in the 18th and 19th centuries, this is the beginning of the Romantic movement in Europe and sort of across the West. And what does the Romantic movement do? Well, it sort of loves, like I said, antiquarianism. It loves looking to the past and idolizing golden ages. And there's a flourishing of something called Neo-Celtic Christianity. A big proponent of this was Richard Williams Morgan, who founded the Ancient British Church. This was in 1858. I should say the 19th century was also a time of explosive growth in Protestant denominations all across the West. You have all sorts of microcosms of Christianity. Every flavor that you can think of was popping up and people were founding churches. The Ancient British Church was one of these denominations. It since evolved into about 6 different denominations at the end of the 19th and early 20th centuries. But they all sort of appreciated this Celtic tradition, right? And so what about the this antiquarianism that we have in the Romantic movement? Well, it upholds and values the noble savage, right? The noble savage has intrinsic qualities that we modern people don't have. Remember that the 19th century is the Industrial Revolution, especially in England. And so people are toiling away in factories, and we want to look to more pastoral, more bucolic, more rural areas of the world and say that this is where life ought to be, right? And especially back in the day, those golden ages, those were the people who had it right. And in the 19th century, there was an opportunity to get a glimpse of this. So even though in England was modernizing, industrializing out in the outer reaches of the British Isles, in Ireland and in Scotland, it was still pretty medieval. The crofters and the Highlanders, these were people that were just a stone's throw away from being peasants and serfs of the Middle Ages. And the Romantics looked across the Irish Sea and said, aha, these noble savages, these Irish men and women, these Scots, these noble savages, they've got it right. There's something about their language, about their culture that has retained this pure essence from a millennia ago. And of course, this is all hokum, right? This is not actually the way it was, but this is how the Romantics saw these rural people in the Irish Isles and in Scotland. They were more poetic, more spiritual. They were freer of the rationalism that we had here in England, right? They had an inner spiritual nature that shone through even after their form of Christianity had been destroyed. And it's interesting, they would look at sort of the hymns and prayers that were being said out in Western Ireland and in Scotland. And they could divine by reading the tea leaves that the theologies present there were the ones that St. Patrick himself had instilled in these people, thinking that, of course, there had been no evolution in Ireland or in Scotland over the past, millennia plus. And so what did these romantics decide? What did they see? Well, they had this idea that there was a Celtic church. Now remember, I've said, back in the 4th and 5th century, there was not a sense of a Celtic church and a Roman church. There was the church in the West, and all of these people viewed themselves as being in communion with each other. But by the 19th century, the English Church of England historians and churchmen started defining what was the Celtic church. Well, it was a church that was guided by abbots rather than bishops, remember, right? It allowed women more power than what was customary for the day. It was environmentally friendly. It was sort of a green church, right? In touch with nature. And it was sort of always in conversation with paganism, with Druidism, with these naturalistic spiritualities. And this is what became a definition of the Celtic church. So now that I've given you this long history, the question is, do you think that's true? And that is a rhetorical question because I can answer it for you. No, it's actually not true, right? The church back in the 4th and the 5th and 6th centuries, the Celtic church and the Roman church were just different flavors of Western Christianity. And if you talked to the people back in those centuries, they would have said, oh, no, we're not actually in conflict. Yes, we disagree with how to calculate the date of Easter and how to cut our hair, but we still all are in communion with each other. We recognize the Pope in Rome. And for that first millennia and a half until the Council of Trent, right, diversity in worship was actually the norm in the West. So everyone has their own different rite of worship, their different canons, their different Eucharistic prayers, their different calendars of the saints, and everyone is fine with that. So, the sense that this church was somehow different is not really the case. It was not more environmentally friendly than the church in Rome. It was not more influenced by paganism than was the church in Rome. Same thing with women. There was no evidence that it allowed for roles for women any more than the Roman church. And in fact, it was ecclesially structured around bishops. Yes, there were powerful abbots, and monasticism was a big part of Celtic Christianity, as it was elsewhere in the West, even in the Roman church. But they had bishops. And if you remember back to the Synod of Chester, right, it was all about the bishops, not the abbots. It was the bishops that were in conversation there. So this idea that the Celtic Church really stands in opposition to the Roman Catholic Church is something that comes about because of the Protestant Reformation and is amplified in the 18th and 19th century by romantics that really want, for a very political reason, to differentiate themselves from Roman Catholicism. I'll also point out that in the 19th century, you have the First Vatican Council, which in a very strong way codifies the monarchical papacy, that the Pope is an absolute ruler. And of course, if you're a Protestant of any stripe, you're going to want to differentiate yourself even more from the Roman Church and say, here's all the ways in which the Celtic Church, quote unquote, is different from this beast in Rome, right? So always be aware of the biases of history. And the biases of history have shown us that the Celtic Church really was not rediscovered in the 18th and 19th century, but in many ways was created in the 18th and 19th centuries. At least the type of church that is handed down to us in the 20th and 21st centuries, which Father Jay is going to talk about next Sunday. There is an authentic aspect to Celtic Christianity, but it is not the one that is couched in opposition to Roman Christianity in the way that we might believe. That is actually a consequence of the polemics of the 19th century. It's something to be very aware of. So, oh my gosh, 3 minutes over. That is I'm done with my slides. That is the fast and the dirty of how we moved from the Synod of Whitby through the Middle Ages to the Romantics of the 19th century, and where we get this idea of Celtic Christianity. Now, I'm going to open it up for some questions and conversation. Any of this that you have questions about, also for you, Jay in the room, please ask me. But also, any of this strike you as novel or interesting? Any of this like, oh, I didn't realize that. When I'm going to end my share screen here.
When you said there was a tremendous diversity
Yeah.
in the Celtic Church originally,
Mm-hmm.
did that include language, or was it all?
So, in the West, so yeah, the question, this was Christina asking the question. I don't know how to end my screen sharing. So the question is, was there language differences in Celtic Christianity, or was it all effectively in Latin? Sorry. Yeah. Oh, there you go. Stop sharing. Thank you. There we go. Well, the answer is it's all in Latin. So when it comes to worship in the church, even from the very beginning of Christianity as it spread through the Roman Empire, it was in Latin. So everyone spoke Latin for worship. And even in the Celtic Church, they would be speaking variations of Latin. Latin was the lingua franca. It was the language of the educated throughout Western Europe. And as much as we would like to say, well, there was sort of an authoritative Latin, Latin was also influenced by the different flavors of the culture. So, you might have like an accent to the Latin a little bit. It would have been perfectly understandable to someone from Rome, someone from Paris, someone from London, and someone from Iona. They would all have understood the church Latin being said in any of those places, even if the worship itself was different, the prayers were different, they could all understand the same Latin.
So hegemony often, is alive with language dominant.
Yes. So the Latin was the dominant language, but how the church evolved was sort of de-evolved. It's not the type of strong federalism that we see in the Roman Catholic Church. Now, it's more like a confederation. So you have all these different churches, and they would not have even seen themselves as national churches, because this is sort of before the development of strong nation states. So you have the Holy Roman Empire, you have the German states, and you have England as well. But not until you get until the age of expiration do you have the development of strong national identities that are opposed to one another. In pre-Reformation Europe, especially at this time, people all saw themselves as part of Christendom and just different corners of it. And, languages, of course, were different. So the peasants were all speaking Irish in Ireland, and in England, they were all speaking a variation of Anglo-Saxon German, sort of with a little bit of influence of French, Old English. And when they went to church, they heard it in Latin. So, yeah. The language as sort of a determinant of culture looked a little bit different in the Middle Ages than it does now, right? Because in the Middle Ages, the culture, of course, was worship of God in church. I should say that universal culture. What was happening in individual states was very dependent upon the economies of the area. And that localism still won out. Even though everyone's speaking Latin in church, in that church culture, the local cultures and the differences there actually are the ones that driving the variety. And it's only after you have a lot of interconnectivity in the Protestant Reformation, when the world is becoming much, much more connected for the first time in a long time, that you have people saying, okay, we can actually be much more conformed and uniform among Christendom. And that's what you have in the West with Roman Catholicism. So, other questions? Wave your hand. Oh, I see Mary Ellen.
Since I grew up in the Latin Church prior to Vatican II, which is about 1960, we had a missal at the time everyone was using called the St. Joseph Missal. And Latin was only being used for the scriptures. And I'm going to have a question. Latin, we were taught that Latin was for the educated. And when all of a sudden things changed at Vatican II, and you could now conduct the Mass and the liturgy and the entire Mass in the language of the country and of the people, I think it was called. So I'm thinking that as you say this, that Latin was spoken in church, just in my experience, Latin was spoken only in scripture. When I used my missal, I had Latin in red on the left side of the page of the gospel, and it was read in Latin. On the right side of the page was English. But when the sermon was given,
right,
and the prayers were given, they're the local language. Was that in the period that speaking of them too?
Yes. So the sermon was in the vernacular because that's how people would actually understand what's going on, especially if you didn't understand Latin. The scriptures in Latin, but I can't speak to your personal experience, Mary Ellen, but it's my understanding that even before Vatican II, that the prayers themselves would be in Latin, especially the canon of the Mass, the Eucharistic prayer, would have been in Latin, not in English. In fact, that would have been probably the most important thing apart from the gospel that needed to be in Latin, because it's just the way that from the Council of Trent through Vatican II, it's the Roman canon would have been in Latin.
Nick Washenko just confirmed it because he grew up in the Latin Church as well.
Okay.
And had to switch over midstream in seminary to Vatican II.
Right.
But he just said all prayers were in Latin.
Okay,
So what we're saying,
thank you, Nick.
What we're saying is only, thank you, Nick, for helping. But, and you already knew it anyway, Father Michael. But so we're saying then, are we in agreement that the vernacular was just for the sermon?
Yes, and that is something that would have been from the very earliest parts of Christianity, because when you have this movement in the first and early second century away from house churches to a much more ecclesial structure, and especially after Christianity in the West became captured by the empire and became the official state religion, Latin becomes the language, the sort of the officiant language of prayer. And it's also the case that many people don't speak Latin, right? So how are they going to have access to worship of God? How are they going to have insight into this? Of course, the sermon will be in the vernacular as well. The one exception to this would actually be in collegiate churches, or maybe in some monasteries, in places where everyone there is in fact educated, everyone knows Latin. You could continue with your sermon in Latin as well. You don't have to switch to what the peasants are speaking if there are no peasants present. And that's, but for most of the people who would experience church, they would hear the sermon in their vernacular, so they could understand, so that the priest could actually, hit it over their heads what they should have been listening and learning about when they were, of course, oblivious to all the prayers and to all of the scriptures that they were hearing. Vernacular. So that's why the Stowe Missal has that end material in Old Irish, right? It's not in Latin, this treatise on the Mass. It's in Irish, so that the priest, who was literate, could read this and explain. It was almost as if it was like a little sermon appended to the end of the Missal, that the priest says the Mass in Latin, and if he doesn't have a sermon for that day, he can pull this out and be like, okay, here's what we're doing in the sacrament of Holy Eucharist. This is why the Mass is important. And of course, all of this is in Old Irish, so the peasants could hear and understand. And no surprise that the little spells, right, are also in Irish, because it's the local people who care, who are the superstitious ones, who care about, spells, not just blessings of my house, but how to, ward off the devil who might, infect my soup or whatever. I don't know what these spells are doing, but a lot of anything that you could possibly imagine, how you're afflicted by evil, there was probably a spell to protect you, right? And of course, if you were a churchman, you probably don't believe in that or care about that, but your people do, and therefore, that's why we have these spells. Other questions, other things about
Hi, it's Alice.
Hi, Alice.
I don't want to jump on somebody else's turn.
No one else has raised their hand, so it's all you, Alice. Ask away.
Okay. A thought and then a question. First of all, you covered a great deal of information over a number of centuries.
Yes.
And I find that all fascinating. And I know from previous forums, one that Father Jay did when he talked about most people at one point in history really didn't have any idea what was going on at the altar, and they might have been in the back just saying the rosary or looking at the stained glass windows in order to learn something. So there really wasn't a real connection between the people and what was happening at the altar. So I think it's fascinating that the people you spoke of that were hearing Old Irish or Middle Irish or whatever were able to hear more than say some of the other people. So I wanted to comment on that. And then one other question, and I'm not sure if it was ever brought up, but this may sound way off subject, but you're talking about all the things last week, all the things that happened. Was there ever any mention of how the Viking, or as we would say Viking raids that happened at the end of the 700s, what effect that had on the Celtic Church?
Well, it has an effect on the church, period, right?
Right, including, say, Sarum or Salisbury.
Yeah, the Sarum, the church in Canterbury, any place where the Vikings raided. In fact, there's a holy island off the coast of Northumbria, Lindisfarne, which is the new Iona, of the East, that was raided by the Vikings many times, and they burned down the monastery there, and the community eventually had to disband or to move onto the mainland. The Vikings were after loot, right? They're after gold and resources. They're not reformers. They're not there to make sure you're saying the right prayers, right? Make sure you're saying the right type of Christian prayers. That's not their aim and their goal. So for the communities that they afflict and sort of extract wealth and value out of, there's always going to be a rebuilding process. And every time there's a rebuilding process, there's an opportunity to rebuild in a different way. And this is why, in part, over the centuries, Christianity in the British Isles became more and more aligned with the rites that were coming out of Canterbury, and out of Salisbury, and out of York, and out of really the English part of the British Isles. Just because, if the monastery has been burned to the ground and you're going to rebuild the monastery, and they often were rebuilt, there's a question: do you rebuild it and pick up the Celtic tradition that was there, or do you rebuild it and do something slightly different? And anytime you have sort of cataclysmic changes in the church, we might be in the midst of one ourselves right now in this pandemic, right? There might be an opportunity to rebuild in a different way, possibly. But yeah, the Viking raids were not, the raids themselves were not the end of Celtic Christianity. And as I said, Celtic Christianity does retain a little bit of its nucleus in the Irish and in the Scottish Isles. It doesn't really disappear completely. It just goes underground. And that's why the Cumdach, the Stowe Missal, was preserved, right? People valued it. And they saw English reformers, they saw probably Vikings in centuries before that, but people who would take this and destroy it. Or if you were Vikings, take it and take the gold out of it, destroy it, not because it was Celtic Christian material, but because it actually had precious metals on it, right? So this is why it was hidden in the wall of that castle.
So can I add
Yes.
answer to that?
Yes, please do. This is Father Jay speaking.
Hello. So I'll just add one perspective. I got to go to the Viking Museum in York years ago. So went to York Cathedral or York Minster and then went to the Viking Museum. And one of the comments that our docent gave was that, as Michael said, the Vikings weren't there to take over. They weren't there to implement a new system. They were there to rape, pillage, burn, steal, and move on. And so the real question is, were there things being preserved before the Vikings came that we now just have no idea about? And it's one of those things you cannot measure, but scholars still wonder, were there traditions going on before the Vikings that perhaps had been preserved and then they were all destroyed? And so we have no idea about them. That was the lasting impact, as I understood it from the Vikings, was if you were trying to preserve something before the Viking raids, it's quite possible that afterwards it was just gone forever. So you can think about kind of like your old family Bible. Maybe there are stories in there, maybe there are certain traditions that are being preserved. You're not really doing them, but you know that they exist and you're preserving them so that if somebody wants to discover them later, that they're there. And then the Vikings came and all the family Bibles were gone. So that's where I think rediscovering the Stowe Missal was so important, because it gives us a glimpse of perhaps all the things that were lost because of the Viking raids. And I think if I remember correctly, at that point, it's also a question of who's paying to rebuild things, right? So who's paying to rebuild the burned down abbeys? It's the Anglo-Saxons, right? And so if the Anglo-Saxons are perpetuating a form of Anglo-Saxon Roman Catholic Christianity, then when you rebuild the burned down abbey, that's what you rebuild. You don't rebuild the old Celtic model that is kind of out of date anyway. I mean, it's kind of like getting insurance money for an old house. Yeah. If it's an old house and it's falling apart and it happens to get struck by lightning and you get a check, well, you build something new and nice. You don't rebuild the old falling apart house. And I think that was the other side after the Viking raids, was everything was built new. And that's where you see a big change in the architecture of these places. That's all I'll add. Thank you.
No, thank you. It's 7 minutes after 12:30, which was, I thought my understanding of that was our end time for this. So I have to get back to Elio. He's with his babysitter. So I need to wrap this up. I appreciate. Louise, one last question, Louise. Ask away.
Oh, I was just going to say that I was talking to my sister about the history of that you've been just talking about, and she said, now it makes Ivanhoe, the history written in Ivanhoe, much clearer.
Mm-hmm.
And I hadn't thought of that, but it's true. I mean, and that's the history that was in my mind about a lot of this. In Ivanhoe, the Anglo-Saxons, Normans, I mean, I don't know what they exactly were relative to the churches, I'm not sure, but that came and that happened. And now I know a little bit more about Ivanhoe, the story. I mean.
Absolutely. I will need to look up because it's not fresh in my mind. But and maybe someone can answer this, maybe Father Jay, but Ivanhoe might come from that 11th, 12th century, high Middle Ages sort of literary burst of content where the Arthurian legends came from as well. Ivanhoe as sort of the myth. I don't know. Do you know when Ivanhoe? Are you looking it up when?
Yeah, so it's written in the 1800s.
Mhm.
And it's about the 11th century. But
Okay.
it sounds like it's kind of what you were saying, is this kind of romanticized
Yeah.
version of the past.
Mhm.
It might
Okay.
be that that's what Ivanhoe is. It's
There you
kind
go.
of a particular way of looking back and writing a story. about
Right.
it.
Okay. We're now almost 10 minutes over, and I do need to head out. So thank you, everyone, for tuning in. We will come back next Sunday, 11:45 to 12:30, to do our fourth and final edition of this. So thank you, everyone.
Thank
care.
you.
Take care.
Thanks, Michael.